All right, hello everyone. My name is Elke Schüssler. I'm Professor of Organization Studies at the Johannes Kepler University Linz, and with me is Juliet Schor, Professor of Sociology at Boston College in the United States. So Juliet is really well known for her work on the sharing economy, which she has published in the last years, but she's also known for her much longer standing work on social issues related to working time, consumer culture, the relationship between work and private lives, inequality issues, and also the climate crisis. She's written about these things and published some best-selling books in the 1990s, just some title: The Overworked American, The Overspent American, and Born to Buy, The Commercialized Child and the New Consumer Culture, some very eye-opening and critical books. And she's also written about the sustainable planet and the sustainable economy, so much more related to climate change issues. And what's really great about Juliet's work, and we'll hopefully talk about that a little bit, is how she has always linked these different social and ecological issues together. And maybe not surprisingly, then when the sharing economy came up, she has led maybe the largest research effort to date, a big research team investigating the sharing economy, which was of course hyped by many and seen as a potential utopian solution for many of these problems, but it has also come with many problems. And Juliet is a scholar who has written about these things in a very balanced way, always pointing out what is positive, what works well in the sharing economy, and maybe what doesn't work so well. And she will publish this year a book linking these streams together called After the Gig: How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked and How to Win It Back. It's forthcoming, or is it already published?
It's out, yeah,
it's
just out.
At University of California Press. And we will talk about this book, of course, the sharing economy more broadly, and then link this to Juliet's prior work on sustainability issues. So welcome, Juliet, and let's dive right in with the general question. Tell us, what is actually the sharing economy and what is potentially utopian about it?
Well, thank you. Great to be here, and happy to talk about these subjects. So, well, the question of what the sharing economy is already gets us into a big controversy. So the broadest definition is a whole range of initiatives, many of them digital and sort of online platforms and apps, but not all, which create different kinds of economic relations among people. A key dimension of this is that they tend to be what we call peer-to-peer or person-to-person. So some of the most famous sharing platforms are things like Airbnb, where people rent out a room in their home to a stranger. And that's another dimension. I've argued that sharing economy initiatives are mostly what we call stranger sharing, so people getting into transactions with people that they didn't already know. So the broadest definition would also include things like ride sharing and ride hailing, food swaps, shared so-called maker spaces, places where people share tools and fabrication instruments and so forth. Food donation apps, but people also use it to talk about things like repair cafes or, service barter initiatives like time banks and so forth. Free cycling, where people are giving things. So the strict definition would say it's really just about sharing assets. So things like Airbnb or car rental platforms or tool libraries. The popular usage is much, much broader and includes kind of any of these sorts of initiatives. And it also includes things that, you'd be very hard pressed to say are really sharing. Uber, for example, I mean, that's a taxi service. What is sharing about it? Well, not really much. Even Uber never claimed to be a sharing economy, sharing platform, although in the press, it's almost always talked about as part of the sharing economy. Now, you ask what's utopian. So when these platforms launched, and most of them, the start of the sharing economy as we know it today was 2008-9. It was during the financial collapse and the Great Recession. That's when Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, and some other labor platforms like TaskRabbit and many others were founded. They had what I've called an idealist discourse, which is they said that all these good things were going to come about as a result of their activities. And those good things fell into three categories. One was economic. So they were going to provide income for people. They were going to provide more availability for consumers because they were lower priced. They were going to cut out the middleman and give more value to the producer and the consumer. They were going to be very easily accessible to people, help us struggling middle class. So the whole range of economic claims, and also including, really important for those that are focused on labor, the ability to be your own boss. Now, they called it micro-entrepreneurship, but the platform isn't really controlling what the worker does in some of these to the extent that people with a boss do. They gave flexibility on schedules and hours of work and so forth. So kind of an economic nirvana or utopia. They also promised to help create social connection, that people would make friends as a result of their, these strangers they met on these platforms. And then the third is that they would bring untold environmental benefits, because if you were ride sharing, fewer people would be driving, fewer people would buy cars. Airbnb was going to stop hotel construction, and those are the three categories of utopian claims that the companies came up with. And of course, many of these initiatives that I mentioned at the beginning were nonprofits, and they too promised these kinds of benefits.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so immediately the sharing economy would potentially be a platform where actually these different social, economic, environmental problems could be addressed in an interlinked way, right? I mean, you already mentioned that it was a discourse, an idealist discourse. So discourse is always put out there by someone, maybe mobilized by someone, and many critics would say, okay, it was just a frame, right? It was just used to sell us something that is not actually sharing. And I think the reality is much more messy, as you've pointed out in your work. So tell us a little bit about what has actually happened. What went wrong? What are some of the problems? You've written about some of them, like inequality, precarious work, and so on.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are some. Let's talk about the for-profit companies, the commercial sharing entities. I think that's what people are most interested in. But I'm happy to talk about nonprofits too, because my research team studied both. In fact, we started with nonprofits, and then as the Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, as they began to get so big, we turned our attention to them. So things aren't the same on all the platforms, but let me start with the labor platforms, and they're the ones where things have in some ways gone most wrong. The issues there have to do with the problems have to do with the exploitation of workers. So ride hail is the biggest sector in the sharing economy. Delivery and lodging are the other two large sectors, and delivery includes both prepared food delivery, Uber Eats, Deliveroo, Foodora, I think was the one. I'm not sure if they're still operating in Europe. We don't have that here, but also package delivery. ride hail is, ride hail faced a very highly regulated taxi industry, both in the United States and Europe. You have a lot of regulations. Now, in Europe, things have been a bit different because Uber has been forced to pay attention to local laws in a number of countries. They've also been banned from other countries. But let me tell you what happened in the United States, because this is the cautionary tale of an absence of strong regulation, which is the government, even though the government did nothing to stop Uber, local governments, even though what they were doing was clearly illegal. They were operating taxis without licenses. And in the beginning, things were pretty good for the workers. There was plenty of demand. They got a high fraction of the fare. People really loved it. Over time, as the company needed to squeeze more revenue out of its ride hail, it began to lower prices to expand its market, which sometimes meant less income for the workers. Sometimes it gave them more work, so it didn't necessarily reduce their income. But after a period of time, it started just lowering their incomes. It let lots of people flood onto the platform, which meant it got harder and harder to get work. And it increasingly upped the fraction that it was taking. So at the beginning, it took a more reasonable fraction, and now you have rides where the company is taking over 50%. You have situations where about a third of the driver's time is spent just waiting for a ride, according to a recent study for Seattle. And if you look at Uber's books, which finally became public when they became a publicly traded company, you can see that they really started squeezing the drivers. A larger and larger fraction of the revenue was going to the company and not to the drivers. So by sort of 2017, 2018, you've got these stories of impoverished Uber drivers sleeping in their cars, deeply in debt because they financed cars to make money on Uber, and just a truly exploitative situation where they're making maybe, $8, $9 an hour below them in these major cities where the minimum wage might be $12, $15 an hour. So worker exploitation became a really big problem, and also control of the workers through these algorithms where they would get deactivated, and sort of harsh treatment by the companies. So the promise of, being your own boss and having a decent wage and something wasn't met. What we found in our research was that if you're what we call a supplemental earner on these platforms, and at the beginning, most people were, and overall, most people still are supplemental earners, but in ride hail, more and more have become full-time earners. If you're a supplemental earner, it's not bad. If you try to make a living on the platform, or you're what we call a dependent earner, you depend on the platform earnings to pay your basic expenses, it doesn't work. You earn poverty wages, they're insecure, you have to bear all the costs and risks yourselves because you're what's known as an independent contractor. You're not an employee, so you don't get any of the rights of employees. So that's what happened in ride hail, a sort of lesser version of that in delivery. Airbnb is an interesting, different story because the problems with Airbnb are not with the people who use the platform. They mostly like it, hosts and guests. It's all the people around them who are affected by Airbnb activity in negative ways. So people who can't get places to rent in cities because so many properties have been turned over to Airbnb. People have to pay higher rents because properties have been turned over to Airbnb and rents have gone up. People who live in neighborhoods that have been destroyed by having so many tourists, or people who unfortunately got located next to an Airbnb property that's used for parties or illegal activity. Some of these have been turned into places where people are buying sex or drugs, or so just like a lot of, negative stuff. So there, it's what we might think of as an insider-outsider problem. Insiders like it, outsiders don't. And, the issues with sort of labor conditions are there on all of the labor platforms. And the issues with these externalities are also, you know, what the Airbnb situation is what economists would classically call externalities. You have those in ride hail too, and they're things like growing congestion, because instead of reducing the number of private trips taken in private cars, ride hail has increased them because it's so inexpensive. It's causing congestion, it's causing a big increase in carbon emissions. And in the United States, it also has been leading to many more traffic fatalities. So a lot of bad, you know, impacts of ride hailing on the public and on the environment.
Okay, thanks. I mean, that was the story of the for-profits. Maybe just an add-on question to that. So I don't know if you've studied it, but would you say companies like Uber and Airbnb, they actually started out honestly thinking they would make the world a better place, and just through the pressure from shareholders and venture capitalists, they had to sort of shift the business model? I mean, Shoshana Zuboff tells a similar story about Google, right? Saying they actually didn't want to be this data extraction company, but then the financial crisis hit and they had to make money somehow, and then they shifted. Would you say something similar has happened with Uber, or would you say it was kind of part of a long-term plan? Yeah.
I think about Uber differently than the others. Uber's the one sharing economy company that really didn't ever have the public interest as part of its self-understanding. It was started by some very right-wing guys who I think had fairly, you know, antisocial and kind of greed-oriented attitude. For the others, I think many of them had a sense of a public purpose and believed in their public purpose, and some of them still do, I think. The pressures to grow are really the key issue here. I mean, for Airbnb, it's its size that's really the problem, much more than its basic model. I mean, one interesting thing about Airbnb, I mean, it takes a reasonable fraction of the transaction. It doesn't gouge the guest or the host in terms of how much it's taking. It's part of why it's been so successful. It's part of why people don't go off platform that much, which is an easy thing to do on these platforms. But Uber was always different. Uber never really had a public-minded dimension to it, I think.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, that's maybe links to one of your papers that you've written, right? Domesticating the market. So it seems that the market logic is a bit of a problem. You mentioned the growth, and we can talk about the nonprofits a bit later. I definitely like to talk about them as well. But tell us a little bit maybe about what your ideas are of domesticating. Is there a model for how it could work?
Yeah, and you're right. That paper and that data didn't include Uber. It was really looking at other Airbnb, TaskRabbit, which is a site where people go and sell their labor for various kinds of tasks. It doesn't. You may have something similar in Europe, but it's not. It's an American platform. As well as nonprofits. We studied a food swap, a time bank, a makerspace. So in all of these, people had what we called this domestic imaginary, the thing in their head that was motivating them. And it was interesting that it's both people on the for-profits and the nonprofits had this. It was an idea of kind of taming the market or domesticating the market, that the sort of global capitalism had gotten out of control, these giant corporations that were dehumanized and treated people in dehumanizing ways, and that what we needed to do was get back to a really human market, a small scale, kind of like a family or a household. That's why we said domesticate, both tame and also become domestic. And you know, many of these activities do take place in people's homes. If we're talking about Airbnb or these labor sites like TaskRabbit, people are asking people into their homes. And what people believed was they wanted an alternative to global capitalism, and they thought that this sort of small scale person to person market could be that, and that by participating in this, they were making a new world. They were remaking the market, creating a new kind of economy. And it's interesting how many people felt that you can do it by your own actions and by participating in these things. I mean, partly it's that these are mostly young people in the early days when we did that research. And many of them didn't have faith in the government making change. I think that's changed in the United States. We have a much more politically oriented, active youth movement now of people who are demanding change from their government, whether it's on climate or inequality. But at this point, this was sort of a way that people could feel they were making a difference in the absence of a government who was, doing anything to make social change.
Yeah, so I mean, it still sounds like a really good idea, but the title of your book, it got hijacked. So who would you say did it get hijacked by, and how can we win it back?
Well, it got hijacked by greed, I think. I mean, that's a sort of simplistic way of talking about it. But, and we sort of touched on this before, but these companies, in order to expand, took on a lot of money from investors at different rounds, angel investors, venture capitalists, etc. One of the interesting things, which I think hasn't been really reckoned with enough, is who these investors were and are. The Saudi SoftBank is, probably the major investor in these startups. Google was a major investor. The big Wall Street firms, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, etc. So all the usual players, the people who were creating that economy that users wanted to get rid of, that global capitalist economy and everything that was wrong with them, same people behind these. And so over time, as these platforms made decisions, took on money and expanded, that pressure to grow. I'm not going to say pressure for profits, because the way this model works is in the early stages, they don't have to make profits. Uber is the most money-losing business of all times. I mean, it's lost tens of billions of dollars. It's never turned a profit or anything close to a profit. But the strategy is grow, 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 dominate your market, and then you can raise your prices to whatever you want because you've wiped out all your competition, including, by the way, in the United States, their hope to wipe out public transportation as a true competitor, so that people have no choice but to use an Uber to get anywhere, and or have little choice. So that's the idea, that expansion and that push to expand is at the root of a lot of the problems that we see in the sharing economy today.
Okay, so what is the role of the nonprofits in all this? I mean, it's sort of some of the arguments of the nonprofits, there's still many small scale sharing initiatives around. They work quite well, but the issue is always they don't scale up, right? So then we have the profit ones, they're going for scale, but then get corrupted. Is there a middle way? Is there a solution to this?
Yeah. So I do think there's a middle way, and it involves two things. I mean, I think for the big ones, they've got to be regulated, or they have to be owned by the users in order to meet those ideals that we talked about at the beginning. There's no way it's going to happen with just, letting the companies do what they want. For the nonprofits, there's sort of two big dimensions of why they didn't scale. One is they didn't have money, so, which the for-profits had so much of. But the other is they often lacked what I termed a value proposition. In other words, they weren't offering what people needed necessarily. Many of them start with ideological aims. And people who share those ideological aims flock to them because, go to them because they believe in those aims. But in the end, they don't necessarily provide people with what they need, because that may not align with the ideological aims. And I'll give you the best example of this, I think, is time banks. So time banks are places where people trade their services with each other. It's a barter system, so there's no money, but I do an hour of work for somebody else, that gives me a credit in my, it's a bank, time bank, in my account, and then when I need something, I get an hour of work from somebody else. They're multilateral, meaning I don't have to, the person I give to doesn't have to be the person I receive from, so more efficient in that way. And everybody's time is valued equally. So that's a big ideological commitment of the time bank, because it operates so differently from the market, in which our time, the money that each of us can earn on the market can really vary a tremendous amount. People join these time banks because they believe in this, and they think it's really going to help people who don't have money and so forth. But most of them didn't really need much. We had a lot of people who would go on there and just do services, and they'd never claim anything back. They treated it more like a charity. We have people who say they just, the services there weren't things that people actually needed. So they might need a plumber, but plumbers wouldn't go on. And so there really wasn't that, people couldn't get that much value out of it. And they treated it more like a political project than an economic one. And so until these, and there's another dimension to a lot of these alternatives too, which is that many of them were founded by people on the left who don't like money, who have a critique of capitalism and with it a critique of money. And so they shun money. So their donation sites or their barter sites or whatever they, but they kind of disdain anything having to do with cash. Well, that's fine if you're a person who has enough cash. But, many low-income people, what they need most is cash, because, yeah, they could barter for some things, but the idea of living a totally cashless life, as some of the people we interviewed told us, that was their goal, to, never have to touch money. Like, that money is so profane, money is so dirty and, polluted, that they don't want to get their hands dirty with it. It's just a real difference between that ideological opposition to money and where, most people in this society are at, and where low-income people want a platform where they can earn some money. So that's been a part of the attention with the alternatives. And I think that, kind of moving a little bit closer to where people, to meet the needs that people have, might actually allow them to scale in ways that would make them more significant.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. So it's also kind of, yeah, what the example you gave sounds like it's an elitist project, which doesn't solve the problems of the 99% or the 80% that you refer to in another paper, right? So let's maybe talk about that paper as well, the inequality within the 80%. What's that about?
Yeah, well, that was really asking the question, who's being helped by these sharing platforms, who's using them, and who might be losing out. One of the things we found, we started studying these entities almost when they, were beginning, and it was almost all young people on them, and they were very, very highly educated. But they were doing blue collar work, kind of manual work, so driving and errands and delivery and so forth, things that had traditionally been done by people without college educations. Taxi drivers generally are not college educated. People who work in hotels as cleaners are not college educated for the most part. So we asked the question there, were these activities crowding out or pushing out those traditional workers? And no one's done a full study of that, but certainly there have been big employment losses in taxis and lesser in hotels, but there is employment loss in hotels as a result of Airbnb. And although these services also expanded demand, we were asking, is it benefiting the sort of more highly educated people within the bottom 80% of the population at the expense of people with low educational status? Because also those higher educated people were often earning additional money on top of their regular jobs. So was it worsening the income distribution, making it more unequal? And we think that's one of the impacts that it's had.
Okay. I mean, maybe as an aside to that, so that's mostly based on data you collected in the United States, right?
Yes.
What would you say about if you look at the countries in the global south, for example? Have platforms had a different impact there? Or would you say it's a similar picture?
I don't think I'm not sure. The online digital labor like Mechanical Turk and crowd work, they call it, where people are doing online tasks, I think do tend to be higher educated people in the global south. Like in India, for example, we have a lot of data on that. The people who are earning money on these global digital labor platforms do tend to be higher educated. But the other, you've got a big growth in things like ride hail and delivery in the global south, and I think that those tend to be those traditional workforces, which tend to be lower educated workforces. They all do tend to be pretty youth oriented.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, interesting. I mean, it just makes the whole economy more complex if we take all these nuances into account. I mean, we've mainly talked about the economic aspects now, and in your introductory statement, you mentioned the 3 dimensions, right? Also, this idealistic idea to change something about the social relations and to change something about the climate crisis. So, can you say maybe a little bit about that? Like, would you say being engaged in platforms, be it for profit or non-profit, has actually changed the social fabric of society in the way intended? Can we be more optimistic there? And what about the environmental side? I mean, we know the ride sharing hasn't worked out, but maybe there are some other examples.
Yeah. So the social picture is mixed. I mean, you do have some platforms that people talk about, real social connection. The Airbnb and other lodging platforms. When you have people staying in other people's homes, you sometimes do get those connections. We have a lot of hosts who talk about that. There's some evidence on some transportation platforms. So BlaBlaCar, which is a long distance ride sharing in Europe, definitely has a positive, according to the research, positive impact of people meeting strangers. That's part of the whole thing. You talk to them, you connect. So there are some platforms where that's happening, but there are others where absolutely no. There are platforms that are like Airbnb for cars, where they're peer-to-peer car rental, where somebody rents out their car to someone else. One of the interesting things on that is, for the most part, and we find this in studies in the United States and Europe, people do not want to meet the owner of the car. They just want a very arm's length anonymous transaction. And so I would say that there's some evidence of social connection, more than you get in conventional businesses for sure. But it also can kind of erode over time. So in the early days, there was more interactions and sociability. And as these platforms get pretty normalized and they don't seem so different anymore, the levels of social interaction often decline. I mean, we saw that in ride hailing. We've seen it in Airbnb too. More and more people never meeting their host or never connecting.
Yeah.
So that, I would say, is a little bit of a mixed picture. On the environmental impacts are pretty uniformly terrible. And it was obvious from the beginning why the story was wrong. And you can explain why in one sentence. transportation and accommodation or travel. Those are two highly carbon intensive activities. What these platforms did was they dramatically lowered the cost in those sectors. Well, of course, consumers are going to want to buy more of them, and demand went up. And that's like the big story of the climate impacts of the sharing economy. The little story is all of those efforts to reuse goods or donate goods and so forth. And there, you know, while you have in some cases some small impacts, they're small, number one, because these platforms haven't scaled. There's just not that much activity on them. But then you also have the problem of what are called rebound effects, which is if I get some food on a food donation platform, and I mentioned this one because a colleague is doing some research on this. There's a food donation platform. You sign up for this app. People are giving cooked food away, or you're giving yours away. It's great. People are transporting it on bicycles or walking or public transportation. So in the first round, it's actually good. It's reducing food waste. There's not a lot of transportation emissions going along with it. But let's say that every lunchtime for the, you know, over the past month, I got a free sandwich on this donation app and I didn't buy a sandwich. And now I have, you know, a couple of $100 that I wouldn't have had if I'd bought my lunch every day. And you know what? Let me just book a cheap flight and, you know, go to another city for the weekend because I've got all that money. So the so-called rebound effects, or like the second and third round effects, when you calculate everything that happens as a result of this sharing, it might turn out to be negative. I mean, that's one of the big reasons Airbnb has a big carbon footprint. Not yet measured, but it makes it a lot cheaper for people to travel, especially if you rent your house out, then you can and you go to an Airbnb wherever you're traveling to. The travel cost is just the ticket, and you don't have the, I think I'm gonna have to, it's just the ticket, and you don't have to pay for the lodging. And so that's a big reason why the environmental impact of the sharing economy has been very different than what people hoped it would be originally.
Okay, well, that's pretty depressing. So we save stuff, resource waste in some area, and then all we have to do is to spend it on something else that is even more resource intensive, to put it that way. So let's maybe then come back. Yeah, let's maybe come back to. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, there are ways to mitigate those impacts. I mean, so I don't want to leave everyone with a terrible, you know, depressed feeling that no matter what we do, it just leads to more emissions.
No, we come to that. We'll come to that now, which is your vision for a sustainable economy and a sustainable planet, because you've written about that in the 1990s. So what was your idea then, and how has it maybe changed now, taking account these new possibilities that are still there by the sharing economy, for example?
Yeah, so this discussion of rebounds actually leads to the core, the core of the vision. So one thing is, I'm just going to adjust my light here. So one thing is definitely clear. We've got to transition off fossil fuels. We have to do it in an equitable way, just transition, and we've got to get onto clean, renewable energy sources. But that's not going to be enough, because if we keep just trying to expand demand and grow, it's just not going to be possible to dematerialize and decarbonize to the extent that we need to do, and in the timeline that we need to do it. So we have to do what I, you know, think of as kind of powering down. We've got to control the demand for energy, which means control the demand for goods and services. Now, how do you do that? You can't just say to people, oh, don't spend your money, you know, just consume less. I mean, people have been giving that message for a long time. A few people may do that, but for the most part, people will spend the money that they have. And so you need to restructure the economy in ways that doesn't put all that purchasing power into the system. So you have to control the demand for energy. That's how you deal with the rebound effects. That's how you can transition off polluting fuels in ways that actually will dramatically lower emissions. And I've come to the conclusion, this is where I started in the 1990s, you mentioned that, and I'm still here, even more firmly a believer in this, that for wealthy countries, there's no way to do it other than by reducing working hours. And that's how you power down an economy. You give people more free time instead of just channeling more and more money to them. The time is very valuable. It allows people to do all sorts of things with their lives. They're no longer chained to a job, and especially in countries with long hours. I know, you're in Austria, Germany. These are the shorter hour countries of Europe. But
in theory,
the less kind of time people have to devote to their jobs, the more they can determine their own lives and live in the ways they want to and so forth, and do some of those things that the sharing economy promised, which is gain control. And that's why I got into studying it in the first place, because I saw it as a part of a shift towards people working fewer hours for, in a main job, doing a little more self-provisioning, using some of these alternatives to get some goods and services, and having a more diverse set of income and goods, and services streams. So that's the core of it. I've done a lot of work showing shorter hours are associated with lower carbon emissions. The countries that grow really rapidly have high emissions. The countries that have sort of lower growth and take more of their productivity increase in the form of shorter hours, like Germany, like France, Netherlands. They've done much, much better on emissions. So that's the first part of it. And the second is dealing with inequality, because inequality makes all of these things worse. More inequality leads to higher working hours, leads to higher carbon emissions. More inequality leads to higher carbon emissions on its own. It also leads to a worse functioning economy and on many other dimensions, and a worse functioning society, more ill health, more social problems, more conflict, less well-being. So more equality, more free time, more self-determination. And then the last component of this, which is something I've only come around to in recent years and was not there in my vision in the 1990s, is basic income, universal basic income. I just think the world has gotten so much more insecure. The labor market is so much more precarious, you mentioned earlier, and insecure. Artificial intelligence is threatening the jobs of many more people. We really need a collective commitment to everybody's basic security. And I think UBI can do that. It can also help cushion lower hours of work.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, and like you say, it's probably the mix of all these things, because if you get people to work less, how do you ensure they're not jumping on the next flight to Hawaii, right? Or to wherever a faraway location. And that needs to be filled with other meanings as well, right? And other things to do in life. And I suppose that's how these things link together. And that's also where the sharing economy can find its place, if I understood you correctly.
Absolutely. So if you are on a trajectory, if your economy is on a trajectory of progressively shorter hours of work, so you kind of gradually reduce hours of work, the way Germany, France, Netherlands have been doing for a long time, and Austria too, I believe. If you're on that trajectory, then you sort of, people won't be getting more and more income every year to buy new things. So you need a kind of consumer patterns need to shift also. And that's where you know, doing some self-provisioning. Maybe you're doing a little gardening. Maybe you're selling a little bit of what you garden to somebody else so you can buy some, you know, a little bit of their thing. Maybe you're doing more sharing, swapping, donating, receiving. So it helps, it allows people to get access to goods and services without having to earn a lot of cash to do it. And so it sort of changes our consumer lives from being oriented to purchasing new goods, you know, at a store, a mall, online, to satisfying more of our needs for goods and services through handcrafted, local, artisanal, swapped, donated, used, etc. So it revitalizes that economy of reuse and resale as well.
Okay, so maybe as a final question, to get back to the difficult, hopefully not too pessimistic end. I mean, I think most people would agree to this being great and welcoming it, but I guess the ones that wouldn't immediately be happy with that idea would be the companies saying, okay, we just can't compete in the global economy in that way. So what would be your answer to them? And the policymakers that, of course, have to provide the framework for the economy to go into that direction.
The economy that they have created is an economy of death. It's killing the planet. It's killing the people on the planet. It's not working. We absolutely need a fundamental change in our economy. So companies that recognize that and are willing to do things differently, are willing to really be true social and ecological citizens and provide things in ways that are ecologically sustainable, socially sustainable. There's a place for those companies, but the ones who won't, there is no place for them in the economy of the future because they are destroying our future. And this is the whole fossil fuel industry. This is the chemical industry. These are kind of exploitative companies that are using sweatshop labor, that are not cleaning up after themselves and so forth, that are companies that are based on just selling more and more and more. And so we can look to a handful of companies who are really trying to do things differently and say, you know, those are companies that deserve to be supported. But I would say the vast majority of companies in the world are not there yet. Mm-hmm. And, you know, right now they're trying to take the planet down, and we've got to fight them with everything that we've got.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you so much, Juliet, for sharing these insights and your vision for a more sustainable future. And do check out Juliet's new book on the sharing economy. Okay, so let's say bye.
Thank you. So long. It's been a great pleasure.